At this time, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Jamie Freeman, Senior Vice President of U.S. Medical Affairs at Genentech, who will be the moderator of the Advancing Inclusive Research panel. And Dr. Freeman, I turn it over to you and your panel.
Thanks very much, Mark. And it's really a pleasure to be here with the other panelists on the topic of advancing inclusive research. Before I introduce them, I wanted to show a short video that's from Genentech about our commitment to inclusive research. Amir or Mark, if you could start that video, that'd be great.
So our world is changing. The tapestry of genetics is changing.
Scientific research has produced significant societal advances. However, not all segments of the population have benefited equally.
You know, if you're not at the table, it's really hard for you to have an impact.
If you're not reaching many ethnicities well, how can we actually have personalized healthcare?
And right now, not enough of our trial patients reflect the diversity of patients who experience disease.
It's not personalized if you're a minority.
So it's very important to me that research include all of those people so that we can understand the disease process better and understand how our therapies work in all of these populations.
I'm excited about the opportunity to really be a catalyst.
Genentech is actually asking the right questions and trying to make a social contribution.
It's an imperative. It's not an ethical dilemma.
This is important to Genentech as a business because every patient matters.
Future medicines have to be designed for the patients of the future, and understanding these differences across populations are important now, and they're going to become increasingly important in the future.
It's really important to Genentech to have inclusive research and have participation in our clinical trials of all kinds of people. And I'm really excited that we have an opportunity to advance that now.
Thanks very much. So last year at Genentech in U.S. Medical Affairs, we ran the largest trial for underrepresented minority patients in the U.S. and extended it actually to South America and Africa for a treatment with COVID-19 pneumonia. This has really propelled us forward in doing inclusive research trials across different disease areas. In addition, we adapted to COVID-19 by running a virtual decentralized clinical trial across the entire Veteran Affairs Health Network that addresses not only racial disparity, but also geographic disparity. And I'm now going to introduce the panelists that are coming on to discuss more about inclusive research. First, I wanted to start with Dave Whelan, CEO of BioscienceLA, and to the entire BioscienceLA team for putting this event together and bringing together this nexus of expertise. Last year, Dave was named the first permanent CEO of BioscienceLA, an independent nonprofit with a mission to grow life sciences innovation in the LA region. Previously, he was an integral part of the creation of the New York Genome Center, where he served as SVP, Business Development and Chief Strategy Officer. Dave has spent many years as a startup advisor, mentor, and judge with organizations like Cedars-Sinai Accelerator and LARTA. He holds an MBA from the UCLA Anderson School and a Bachelor in Science in Symbolic Systems from Stanford University. The other panelists I'd like to introduce, we're joined by Narimon Honarpour, who's the Vice President and Head of Translational Medicine at Amgen, who brings to our discussion the valued perspective of data-driven expertise in clinical translational research and clinical trial experience. Welcome also to Melissa Archer, Director of the Clinical Trials Office, Keck School of Medicine, University of Southern California. Melissa joined the Clinical Trial Office at USC in 2016. Her work has been focused on clinical trials for the past 10 years of her career. Prior to that, she spent the majority of her career as a medical malpractice and hospital litigation attorney in the Tampa Bay area. She is a graduate of the University of Florida and Stetson University College of Law. And then finally, welcome to Dr. Karol Watson. Karol is Professor of Medicine Cardiology and the John C. Mazziota Term Chair in Medicine at the Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Dr. Watson also serves as Director of the UCLA Barbara Streisand Women's Heart Health Program, co-director of the UCLA Program in Preventive Cardiology and Director of the UCLA Cardiology Fellowship. She is a principal investigator for several large NIH studies, and her research focuses on prevention of heart disease, vascular calcification, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, and cardiovascular disparities. Okay, well, welcome to the panel. I'm going to open up with my first question, and I'm going to hand it over to Narimon to respond first. The past year has highlighted the need to rethink how we deliver healthcare and also how to better reach underserved populations. Where do you think the greatest opportunity for innovation will be in the next 5 years to ensure more equitable access and delivery of care?
Thanks, Jamie. Let me just do a quick audio check. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yep, perfect.
Wonderful, thanks. Well, let me first say that by framing this question in the form of equity, I think we're wanting to call out that there's a difference between having equality in healthcare and equity in healthcare. And the way I think about these two concepts is that equality really speaks to where we are all starting out and hoping that we all start out in the same place. Equity, on the other hand, really emphasizes where we end up. We all want to end up with the same type of outcomes in healthcare. Now, equity is our goal, and I think we need to ensure that we do focus on that, but I don't want to lose sight of the equality in healthcare. And there are a lot of traditional opportunities, if you will, that remain on the table that include things like putting long-term investments in play. These are necessary to deliver quality healthcare services to underserved populations, making sure that these populations and communities have access to those healthcare facilities, and also making sure that we buttress those investments with aggressive education campaigns. Now, from a perspective of innovating our studies and innovating a process to enhance diverse patient enrollment, particularly from a clinical trial perspective, lately we've been looking a lot at digital tools. I think this was mentioned earlier in the introduction. These types of tools can help us with real-time monitoring of our clinical trials. They help us set targets and help us keep track of our targets with that real-time monitoring. The other part where these digital technologies and analytics can help us as well is with the recruitment, as well as inclusion of different databases that are more inclusive of different populations, oftentimes minority populations, those underserved communities as well. So there's a lot going on in the digital space these days, particularly in the clinical trial arena, and I'm anxious to see where we'll be headed.
Very good. Thanks for your perspective, Narimon. That was really helpful. Melissa, can I hand it over to you to respond?
Sure. So Melissa Archer, as mentioned before, I work at USC, and the benefit of where we are at the Keck School of Medicine is that our hub is in the center of Los Angeles, where 85% of our residents are from underrepresented minority groups. So the one takeaway that I have from being here for 5 years is that it's critical to have community outreach. You have to be able to talk to the folks that live in these areas, understand what their health priorities and concerns are, and then take that information back and have representatives from local communities that you can use as research ambassadors. That's what we've been doing at USC, and we've been wildly successful in having them deliver information to the residents around USC. And also, as a result of these efforts that are largely driven by the CTSI and Dr. Tom Buchanan and others, more than half of our clinical trial participants are from these unrepresented minority groups. So just having community outreach and understanding what the needs are critically important. We've also had some other great health presentations by researchers for COVID-19 related, like town halls. That's been very successful. And we've also, I'm sorry, I'm looking at notes and not looking at notes. So we have a lot of different resident programs where it takes a community of people, and it takes working together to understand what's needed.
Thanks very much, Melissa. The community outreach is so critical to be able to get access to underrepresented minority patients. Dave, what is BioscienceLA doing about all this?
Yeah, no, thanks. And I'm going to echo a little bit what both Narimon and Melissa said, but just to put it in context, BioscienceLA is really an organization that exists to drive innovation in healthcare and life sciences across the region. And coincidentally, my first day on the job as CEO was last year, Monday, March 16th. So I've sort of come in as LA was shutting down, and what I thought was really about life sciences, healthcare innovation, certainly is true. But if we think about this healthcare crisis, which led very quickly to an economic crisis, which has then been amplified or exacerbated by multiple social crises, especially in a place like Los Angeles. Everything that has been said, so far is true. And what I think is really interesting is part of the access to healthcare question becomes more and more about access and equity around technology. And this is, this might be education and access to technology. It could be as simple as, what we've seen even just the past few months with, say, vaccination scheduling and sort of challenges that senior populations had in, accessing the internet or staying online. But more than that, to echo what Melissa said, this idea of how do we build communication systems? How do we create awareness, build engagement across multiple populations where sometimes those are populations that don't know where to turn for resources. Sometimes they're populations that don't necessarily want to sign up for something, don't want to sign up for a test, a test schedule or a vaccination record because of other reasons. And so there's a lot there about meeting people where they are and starting to build systems that will support them, but also make them feel good about not just the healthcare, but about kind of the society around them.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. I totally agree. I think treating patients where they are is really the best way to include patients, and having the right systems and databases to support that. Karol, I was curious from your cardiovascular disparity work, how you're doing inclusive research.
Right. So given our research interests, it's imperative that we have diversity in our studies. And we have had to think about a lot of different strategies to achieve that. So one of the things we did, the first thing we did was decide where to locate our research center. So we're, UCLA is in the middle of, Brentwood, Beverly Hills, Westwood, Santa Monica. We had to go away from that, and we had to find a center where we could go to the population. So meeting the participants where they are is critical, just as everyone has said. So I am pleased to report that we have about 1,200 research participants, a quarter white, a quarter Black, a quarter Asian, and a quarter Hispanic, because we've gone into those communities. The other thing that's so important is establishing trust, and I have to agree with what others have said on the panel. It is not just about going in and figuring out what we can take from those communities, but figuring out what we can give to those communities. So we host health forums and give out information about diabetes and conditions that are important to those populations so that they trust us. And again, once you build those coalitions, everything becomes easier. And I have to point out that this past year has really highlighted disparities. But this is not new. This has been going on forever. And if you look at our research studies and look at who gets included in the trials, for years it's been about a 60-year-old, a little bit chubby white male, and not a lot else. And so we have to figure out how to fix that.
Thanks very much, Karol. And I don't think we can emphasize enough how important trust is in being able to do inclusive research. So I'm going to go on to another question. Digital health is a growing area with so many possibilities and applications, including huge opportunities to foster cross-industry collaborations. How can we as industry leaders better leverage each other's strengths and advances to deliver more equitable healthcare? And are there any examples of ongoing collaborations or work? So Narimon, can we start with you again?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So I'll approach this from a clinical trial perspective and a clinical trial centric perspective. I think one area that we've heard of that's been incredibly powerful in this regard is having connectivity to data, trying to identify what we don't know, having data across healthcare systems, of course, in a compliant and confidential way, helps us reach diverse populations and include them in our studies. I'm really pleased to say that we're actively working on initiatives with partners to do this, oftentimes third parties, sometimes directly with academic medical centers like those represented here today. Another practice that we've started recently, which was accelerated from the pandemic, has been this so-called decentralization of clinical trials. And I just want to spend a second to describe what that means. Typically when we would run a clinical trial, a patient would have to go to a particular site. They'd have to spend a lot of time at that site getting ready. They have to deal with inconveniences like taking time off work, finding parking, dealing with other issues that really are downers in terms of trying to get something basic done in terms of your healthcare. And so what we have tried to do is simplify that through a so-called decentralization scheme. And this isn't unique to Amgen. Of course, many pharmaceutical companies, other sponsors are pursuing this. I think at the NIH, they're pursuing this. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to leverage tools like telemedicine, at-home nursing services, and direct-to-patient delivery of therapies to ease the burden of participation in a clinical trial. I mean, it's oftentimes forgotten that people have to invest their time to come into a clinical trial and participate. This can take hours for a visit. It's not fair to the patient, particularly those that don't have flexibility with their work, to say, all right, well, we want to make this trial available to you, but you're going to have to spend 5 hours any particular day to complete your visit. And, what your boss says about that is your problem, not our problem. Clearly, there's going to be an equity issue with that. So we've tried to make it easier by taking the trial home, or at least to areas that are closer to home, so they don't have to come to a brick and mortar institution that may be many miles away and very difficult to get to. I think finally, as part of this effort as well, we're seeing more and more remote monitoring tools become relevant. These tools are providing us with better quality information, more detailed information. Let's take the example of weight loss. Oftentimes what we're interested in studies for weight loss is, well, what's happening to what the patients are eating and how active they are. I can't tell you how notoriously inaccurate patient diaries are in telling you, well, yeah, this is what I've eaten, this is how much activity I've had over the past month. You wouldn't expect that information to be accurate. But if you have something tracking the patient's data passively and they understand that, this can give you a far better idea of what's going on with the patient, and it can prevent some visits from having to occur in the first place. So I see that this is an area where we're starting to gain some experience with our studies, and I think it's great gaining traction in the industry. Ultimately, all of these things that I'm mentioning really comprise elements of an initiative at Amgen that we call next generation trial execution. And the intent of all of this at the end of the day is to make clinical trial participation easier for both the sponsors, the participants, and the providers, and to make the participation more available. And I think in this way, we can leverage each other's strengths and deliver this type of care to patients more effectively. Thanks.
Thanks, Narimon. So do you think this is an adaptation to the pandemic, and are virtual decentralized clinical trials going to become the norm?
That's a two-part question. Let me first address the earlier question. I think there's no question that the pandemic accelerated this. If you asked us, though, 2 years ago, hey, do you think that patients someday will be able to be taken care of at home without having to drive to their doctor's office or to a clinical trial site to get all of this stuff done, particularly when you're asking them simple questions or to get some basic monitoring done? I think every one of the panelists here would say, absolutely, yes, that day is coming. So I think we knew that this was going to be an eventuality, but what has really gotten us over our scruples and discomfort is absolute need that came from the pandemic, where people either didn't want to step out of their home because of fear, or frankly, the facilities didn't have space. This affected us as a sponsor, not uniquely. There was a period of time where, hospital beds was at an extreme premium and shortage across the country and across the world. Could I, in good conscience, say, well, let's squeeze one bed open for a clinical trial participant? Absolutely not. So these types of things have become absolutely important. And I do think, to your second part of your question, it's going to be more and more of the norm. Not only has experience contemporaneously taught us that these things can work, but there's advantage to it. We're talking about diversity and inclusion today. There is an advantage. The other piece is that it's economically favorable. If we don't have to have a brick and mortar institution with overhead associated with that and staffing and parking and all that stuff just to get a simple assessment done, that's better for the whole healthcare ecosystem. And I hope one day it will drive down costs of these things as well.
Thanks very much. Dave, what digital tools are you using for research?
Yeah, so as an ecosystem catalyst, we have the benefit of really looking across the entire region and both helping collaborate with organizations as well as seeing what others are doing. And so I want to highlight a couple. One in particular, since we're at least spiritually sitting at UCLA right now. UCLA Health and UCLA Biodesign, which is a great program that launched a few years ago, sponsored by UCLA Health, the med school and UCLA Anderson, received a grant from the EDA, something called the Sprint Challenge, which is basically a national pandemic response grant program. And BioscienceLA collaborated with them on that as well. And we're basically building a COVID accelerator here in Los Angeles. So this is bringing together collaboration, innovation, digital tools around a few things we've mentioned, from prevention to diagnosis to treatment, but most importantly, health equity. And this is going to involve really pulling together, hopefully some of the others here on this panel and others who are watching, to be able to bring some digital solutions together to reach people remotely, to reach them where they are, accelerate development. And that's going to be joined by some favorite companies here in LA, like ModiSpark and Consejo Sano, both of which are very focused on delivering multicultural patient engagement solutions. So, and that's everything from, are we speaking the right language, to are we telling the right stories, to are we asking the right questions, to ultimately, are we understanding how are individuals different? And a final one that's really exciting. So I mentioned you mentioned I've worked with LARDA Institute over the years. LARDA, in conjunction with the Lundquist Institute and Biolabs, launched a accelerator program earlier this year called Heal.LA. And the programming around that is very much focused on supporting ventures that are led by diverse entrepreneurs, innovations that are targeting disease and chronic conditions that are disproportionately affecting certain populations, and really focusing on patient visibility, patient access. And so all of these are really pulling together the unique mix of diverse population, diverse technologies, and diverse funding sources to be able to hopefully make some solutions that benefit our population and eventually extend across the country and around the world.
Thanks very much, Dave, for providing that perspective. Melissa, how are data warehouses being used to help recruit diverse patients?
So one of the efforts that we're making at USC is to not lose traction as we continue to have more and more data coming in through these various avenues that have been described today. We want to make sure that we're leveraging all of that and that it's being organized in the most efficient manner possible. There's artificial intelligence and other things that can be used to evaluate the data, and also just to have the ability to use the data warehousing for recruitment, and to make sure that you've got mechanisms that relate to more specific populations. This can impact trial design, and it can make sure that whenever you're designing a trial that you are addressing specific health concerns in various communities. It's funny, the data warehouse is super important. It takes a lot of work, and there are gaps that institutions have in trying to find solutions. And I think that it's going to be critical as we move into this kind of next tier of digitizing medicine, that we share our strengths and our weaknesses and not be afraid to do that, because where USC might experience issues, someone on this panel might have a super simple solution, and just having that their communication to be able to continue to build is going to be critical.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Karol, at UCLA, what kind of digital platforms are you using for research?
So we are really piloting a lot of things right now. We're using our EHR Epic system, but we need to think of other ways. And I got to tell you, one of the things that's true about healthcare research and healthcare delivery, it's fairly conservative and it does not change rapidly. It usually takes disruptors or disruptions to get rapid change, and that's exactly what the pandemic did. So I think we have to leverage that. I think, as you know, there has to be some positive that comes out of that. One of them was that on a dime, we switched from in-person face-to-face visits to telemedicine on a dime. And it's here to stay. And I'm so grateful. It's going to open up accessibility in ways we never thought. And just like the panelists all said, we all knew this was coming, but we thought it would probably be in our kids' lifetime, not ours. The pandemic changed that. But what we now know is that it's not accessible to everyone. A lot of people have done work showing that the elderly, certain vulnerable populations have not had the same accessibility to telemedicine. Therefore, we might heighten inequity and disparities if we just translate the whole system to research. We have to figure out how to make it better. We have to develop digital platforms that all play well together, that interact. We have to bolster the infrastructure so that people who don't have high-speed internet can still access the things we're trying to get to them. We need to actually reach out to populations and ask them, what do you need? What can we do to help you? And honestly, if we test our platforms in the most vulnerable and difficult to reach populations, it will make it good for everyone. So I think that's something that we haven't always done, that we have to start doing. And I told you about the makeup of our research population. I have to tell you, a lot of the strategies that worked really well in Westwood just have not worked well for us at all. What we ended up doing is getting everyone their own UCLA issued cell phone to do a lot of the contact, because they just didn't have the capabilities to do telemedicine and video conferencing.
Thanks very much. What are the type of things, Karol, can we do to be able to provide internet access to patients who can't afford it, or they're not technical?
Well, I think that's well above my pay grade, and I think it's certainly something that I think our current administration is thinking about with the digital infrastructure and high-speed internet, because that's becoming now the entry fee. You can't think of it now as an extra special thing you pay extra for. It's just the way we all are full participants in this society, and certainly in healthcare and research. I completely agree with that. But then again, what we can do is we did offer individuals to participate by coming into our center in a remote location that does have high-speed internet, so we could interact virtually but not be in close proximity. So doing something like that obviously is a potential as well, but it's not optimal, and bolstering the whole infrastructure in the system is what we'd like to see.
Yeah, very good. Just a follow-on question. Maybe I'll ask you, Narimon, from an industry perspective, how important is educating communities around the importance of clinical trials?
It's an absolute must. I mean, you just can't emphasize it enough. And this was something, frankly, I was naive to until I really got immersed in the area of clinical trial practice. I came from academia before joining industry about a decade ago. And I had always taken the education and awareness as a given. I didn't really understand or appreciate that there were, frankly, equality issues with access to that type of information, let alone the equity issues that we're trying to solve today. I think it gets to many and touches on many other concepts that we've spoken to today. One is trust, right? If you don't know something, you're less likely to trust it. And for someone like myself coming from the industry side, and frankly, from a position with clinical trials that have a sordid history, right, in our country and certainly in others with building trust and doing the right thing, it is not helpful. It's counterproductive to not have a well-educated and informed community that you can reach out to. And that gets to some of the activities that we are doing as a sponsor, and I think other industry sponsors are doing this as well, that I wouldn't have thought we would do in years past, namely going into community organizations, asking them to help spread the word, using them as an opportunity to educate their community and their neighbors. It doesn't have to come from me or my institution. In fact, one might argue that it will be more credible coming from trusted members of the community themselves rather than an outsider. And we need to make sure that the messages get across in a way that makes a lot of sense to the community, and that differs, from community to community. Karol just spoke to two very different communities, West Side Los Angeles and Central Los Angeles, extremely different communities, extremely different tools work in those communities, and extremely different messaging resonates between those communities. So it is incredibly important for us on the industry side to underscore the education. I think we need to back the education up with favorable experience. It's not enough for it to be good. It has to be radically good. It has to gain enthusiasm within the community so that people want to and proactively go for participation in clinical trials. Otherwise, at the end of the day, it's not going to work. What you end up with is good intentions that never quite made it across the finish line. And we've seen that. We've seen that with this issue. We've seen it across a variety of social issues in our communities.
Very good. Thanks for sharing all that. Dave, is BioscienceLA doing anything around education?
Yeah, absolutely. That's very much central to what we're doing. And I think just to restate something here, the human side of healthcare often gets forgotten, especially at the research side. And when you think about we have humans developing products to be delivered by other humans to benefit the health and well-being of other humans. And all of those humans are becoming much more diverse, certainly starting on the delivery side or the patient side. And so one of the things that we're building into all of our programming is increasing diversity across that entire value chain. Diversity will drive innovation, and ultimately it will help create products that will meet those patient needs. So one in particular is a program that we launched with support from LA County last year called BioFutures, which is teaming up with community colleges, other schools in California or in the LA area, connecting these students, increasingly diverse students, with internship opportunities where they get a chance to understand everything from med tech to biotech to digital health, gives them opportunities to learn more about these industries, learn about career opportunities, and ultimately be able to hopefully get jobs when they graduate, but more than that, help to educate the companies that they're working for how important diversity is in reaching patients in the right way. And so we're super excited about that and would love everyone on the panel, everyone who's watching, we would love collaboration around that to create some opportunities for students and keep growing that.
That's fantastic. Yeah, collaboration across our areas would be great. Karol or Melissa, when it comes to consenting patients for a trial, how do you encourage different minorities to want to participate in a clinical trial? What's the approach that would work?
I cannot echo strongly enough what Dave just said. Your research workforce has to look like the population you're trying to reach. So as I mentioned, we have a whole bunch of different race ethnic groups, and we have a principal investigator that looks like me. We have research associates that look like every population we're trying to reach. And we have to have people who speak fluent Cantonese and fluent Mandarin and fluent Spanish. So we make sure we have them. And I cannot emphasize that enough. And that goes a long way to helping to build the trust and helping to get the buy-in. But beyond that, we do exactly what you guys have all mentioned. We provide education. We offer, question answer sessions, things that make them know we are invested in that community. We're not here just to be your, to take what we need and then get out. We're here to be a part of this community. And we have been in that community now for 12 years. And we have relationships that are strong and long. And I cannot tell you, could never have begun to have recruited 1,200 diverse participants without the community's help. Just couldn't happen. So all of these, spending the time up front, putting all these things into place, while it will never show up in research funding or grant funding or promotions, it's absolutely essential to success.
Right, I agree completely. And like I said, we have a lot of different community outreach programs at USC, but it's very critical in addition to having caregivers and healthcare providers that, like Dr. Watson said, are very diverse, which we have university level initiatives to make sure that various minority groups are are brought to the hiring table, so to speak, to make sure that the people that are, sometimes you don't even have those folks in the programs to where they could become a physician. So at the university level, we're bringing various groups in for the education and training so they can deliver care to folks in our community. And then, like I said before, just with the community outreach, we have a class that's actually taught. It's called Research 101. And we've reached over 900 people in our community. And that's taught by research ambassadors, folks that are trained by us to go out and explain these things. So they're getting basic information about how research works from people that they are comfortable with and people that they know.
Thanks very much. Narimon, how important is it, the eligibility criteria on a protocol, the inclusion or exclusion criteria to be able to enroll a diverse patient population?
It makes or breaks you. That was a soft pitch, Jamie, and thank you for being so gracious, but it makes or breaks you. Eligibility criteria are contentious all around, even when you're not thinking about diversity and inclusion, right? And I'm speaking to experience in working with regulatory authorities and trying to understand your population. We've spent a lot of time today talking about the methodology of how we want to reach out to the communities, and that is absolutely critical. But at the end of the day, if you're delivering something that isn't practicable to those communities, it's not going to do you a lick of good. So we have to really challenge ourselves and be courageous about the eligibility criteria. Of course, as a sponsor, that's something that makes me a little queasy sometimes because, one of the fastest ways to sink an experiment is to recruit the wrong type of disease or the wrong kind of patient at the wrong point in their disease. But I think as collaborators as part of a broader initiative and trying to do the right thing, we have to be a bit more courageous with our eligibility criteria, making sure that we don't include or exclude something that has an adverse impact on the diversity of patients that come into a study. And I'm very proud to say that we've tried to be analytical about this at our company, Amgen, in modeling what happens to the diversity of your clinical trial, depending on what you do with that eligibility criteria. Now, some of that depends on where you are going to recruit patients, of course, but this is one way that we have tried to apply metrics to what our ambition is. And as they say, you oftentimes can't achieve what you don't measure. So I think we're taking this very seriously at Amgen. The eligibility criteria is very important to ensuring that we have a diverse population enrolled into our clinical trials. And also beyond the doing the right thing initiative of this, we want to understand ultimately how our drugs work differently in different populations. This is an incredibly important point as well. And drugs do work differently in different populations. I think that has been shown over and over again, and has been one of the reasons why we have stated as a standard we need to improve the diversity on our clinical trials. Certainly global regulatory authorities, FDA being one of them notably, has stated that, and put it in the form of an industry guidance. So, we look to work with partners like those on the panel today, others that, are interested in working with us to help improve our diverse population in our studies. And as you pointed out, the eligibility criteria and exclusion criteria for a trial are a big part of that. Thanks.
Thanks very much. So, Dave, can you tell us what is a top priority for BioscienceLA in advancing health equity for 2021?
Yeah, so I think it's encapsulated by everything we've been talking about here, but it really is increasing that diversity, equity, inclusion across the entire continuum. And I'll issue a challenge to all of us, which is a kind of variation on some guidance I got on the corporate side. But if you take a population or take a room that's filled with your researchers, your physicians, your end patient population, and your research subject population, you shouldn't be able to tell who any of those groups are. They should all look alike and sound alike and be a mix. And so if we can build that across all of our programming, I think we'll be reaching the right people in the right way now and in the future.
Thank you very much. So I have a slightly harder question. I think I'll start with you, Karol. Do you think inclusive...
Does it involve math?
No. No, my question is, when it comes to inclusive research, is it about getting access for underrepresented patients on trials, or are there racial differences in the natural history of diseases that need to be addressed? Biological reasons?
That was two questions as well, and I think the answer is yes and yes. But let me tackle the second one first. We know that genetically, we as human beings are all 99.9999999% the same. Race is a social construct based on how people look. Culture is a social construct based on how people live. But certain biologies do segregate along racial and ethnic lines. And it's not because we're genetically different, but probably because we are living differently. So we cannot ignore it, and we have to pay attention to it. That's why exactly like everyone said, we have to enroll a diverse population of research participants to make sure we get that data that we need. What was the first part of the question again?
I forget. But just a follow-on question, I guess I could open up to any of you. What do you think about the use of ancestral genetics to enroll on clinical trials? Is there a role for that?
So ancestral informative markers are just these incredibly old conserved sequences in DNA that tend to come from a certain geographic location. So Africa or Asia and we have looked at that in our research population. So in over 6,000 individuals, we looked at self-reported race, ethnicity, and their ancestral informative markers. It turns out, if you said you were Asian or Chinese, you really had the same ancestral informative markers that originated in China. So that was pretty accurate. If you said you were Black, you mostly had ancestral informative markers that originated in Africa. But there was a lot from over the rest of the world as well, but mostly from Africa. If you said you were Hispanic, it was all bets were off. We couldn't tell where anybody was. So those ancestral informative markers did not perform well at all. And if you said you were white, you tended to have ancestral informative markers from all over the world. So there are limitations, and some, I think hanging your hat on them is not wise for those reasons that I just said. But, there are some interesting perspectives we might be able to gain, but I certainly don't think it's the way we want to go forward with clinical trials.
Thank you very much. I see Mark back on camera. I think we're about to wrap up. Maybe just one last question from Melissa. What's one message you want to leave us with around health equity?
Community outreach is key, and being transparent with your industry partners about where your strengths and weaknesses lie so we can have more collaboration is going to be critical to us moving forward.
Thanks very much. And officially, I think we're done, Mark. I want to thank this esteemed group of diverse panelists and your commitment to advancing inclusive research. It was really a pleasure to be here with all of you and to talk.
Yes, and
thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Jamie, for moderating.
Sure. Thank you.